it's my pleasure to welcome our guests today to talk about something that's very timely and important now, as the world is converging once again at the UN General Assembly. We once again are looking into how we're tracking against the progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals. And with the Secretary General alerting to at the SDG Moments event that when we're talking about targets and percentages, fractions, behind every single fraction and percentage point represents lives changed and lives saved. So it feels like behind tracking and achieving these sustainable development goals from a very objective and neutrality sense of talking about data that hides a lot of complexity when it comes to the social political nuances, the quality interpretations and literacy around understanding whether we are actually achieving those goals or not, regional, international, local perspective and nuances and so on. And I had the pleasure of talking with our presenters today a little bit before the chat, and it really gave me a newfound appreciation on all the dimensions around the use of data when it comes to understanding whether we're on target with the SDGs. And so it's my pleasure to welcome researcher from the EUI, Dr. Gaby Umbach, and researcher Mira Tiwari, and also from UCL, Igor Tkalec, to talk about the book that they have put together to really comprehensively look at the unpacking all the different facets around the use of data when it comes to us talking about achieving SDGs. Gaby and Mira will talk about the framing of the book overall and the backdrop of the book a little bit when it comes to the social political dimensions around evidence-based decision making and the data sets that help founded some of this work. And Igor will alert to some of the key findings and salient points emerging from some of the main chapters themselves. So without overburdening you guys with a lot of pre-talk, let's go over to our presenters today.
Thanks a lot, Sherman, and thank you, Data for Policy community, Zeynep, Pinar, John, Andrew, who are there, for inviting us to this talk. It's a really great pleasure because we are approaching the end of this big and long project of putting together the book, and we're happy to start spreading the news. As Sherman said, we have divided the presentation in a way as to give you a good overview on parts that we did before the book idea came up. So the light of day, and in order to back it up. So I'm, for my part, giving you a bit of an idea of our road to measuring sustainable development, where we came from, and how we approach the topic. So generally, we means the team of knowledge governance transformation at the Robert Schuman Centre of the European University Institute. And ever since 2010, 2011, we work a lot on quantification in politics with a wider view on sustainable development. This started off with the database we created, Global Stat, which is a data repository that zooms out, or at the time in 2015 at its launch, zoomed out from a narrow understanding of sustainable development as combining environmental, social, and economic indicators towards a bigger view on interrelation. So we present data in a bit of a different way than the usual suspects at the time did. The databases in the meantime also integrated in the European Parliament's research service intranet. So whenever people there need to grab hands or have some statistic and data on their hands, we're there to support them. The other two elements that led towards the book were our previous work on global governance by indicators, where we looked into sustainable development, but also sustainable finances, corruption, and governance. And the work on said governance, where we started the family of data sets that Mira is currently expanding on to sustainable development and well-being, with a data set on state capacity and governance. The anchor that brought all of these elements together was a joint focus on politics and sociology of quantification and data science. So whenever we talk about combining data use with policymaking, evidence-informed policymaking, we're not taking a naive metrological point of view to say it's to inject facts into policymaking, but we understand the mechanisms behind that. So, which are normative and political in a way. I will talk about that a bit more. So measuring sustainable development for us brings together this dual focus that we have on the family of governance, evidence-informed policymaking and quantification, looking into how evidence-informed policymaking uses data for politics and policy, how this has governance impact, so impact on processes, audit cultures, indicator processes, well known to all of us, and on the normativity, what data do beyond measuring something in politics. The other leg, if you so wish, the other pillar is sustainable development, where we actually also understand the SDGs as a global framing instrument, a framing power. It being non-regulatory, meaning non-obligatory, non-mandatory, actually missing any sort of leverage to be implemented, yet it's a normative framing, and the SDGs have exerted a lot of traction towards the portfolio, the menu that has been set out for transition and global reforms. And this does something to global governance. So how the SDGs use numbers does something to this dual paradox of global authority rather than power. So that states with big budgets and big administrations yet adhere to something that relatively small global governance institutions set out as a global vision. So this is the focal point of interest for our work. What we assume here is that we operate within our research field under the conditions of evidence-informed policymaking. And that means that generally there is a demand for factual evidence to inform policymaking. The assumption is that evidence is injected to make policies better, but not to refocus the objectives of policy. So this rather decision function where a certain neutrality of evidence is assumed. At the same time, obviously, there are motivations coming in where we say that there is a utility function of this evidence for policy, meaning that it needs to obviously speak to the argument at hand. Policymakers need to find evidence relevant and important to use. And obviously, especially when we look at the SDG, it's important that the evidence that is injected has a certain community credibility and community engagement in creating the evidence. So these are the assumptions that we have at the basis. We turn to, so there are different, within these assumptions, there are different forms and quality of evidence, obviously, theory-based, mathematics, we do have data, we do have judgments, values, emotions. So we don't exclude any form or type or quality of knowledge from the evidence that is useful for politics. We just turn towards statistics because our general assumption is that statistics provide a very robust type of evidence for policymakers to choose. Hence, they have a special role in the hierarchy of evidence, as they allowed for comparison across time and space. And therefore, ever since, and that's not a contemporary development, but ever since the 18th century, this appetite for numbers, for statistics, is closely linked to how we govern. So, meaning that using statistics is something very common, and that is used to frame, assess, and design policies. But our assumption is that this goes beyond neutrality. Obviously, we do have politics at play when we are talking about what numbers to select, how to frame a question, how to make very complex things like sustainable development or equity tangible in terms of measurement. And this is something very important for us to say, that we basically, within political processes, create, in a way and in part, create realities by selecting the numbers, because it makes a difference if I refer to a classical indicator like the GDP, or if I add a bit of a moment of inequality balancing. So what we select as signifiers and indicators is important for how the way the way reality is framed and the way policies are framed. And in that sense, data use has different effects on policymaking and in policymaking. Obviously, first of all, data are subject to different uses. It has different functions. We can diagnose, we can argue, we can flag plan, it's advocacy tools. You can use it in order to create certain dominant forms of knowledge, like we see in the SDGs. So it's not just proving something, it's not just assessing something, measuring something over time. The structural side of it is governance effects, that policymaking turned towards processes that use indicators as a dominant form of policymaking. So measuring as a political process, but also as a process in its own right. Right? All the indicator cultures around the ODA, for example, so official development assistance, in the development context, within the European Union, for example, or the open method of coordination processes, where beyond regulatory approaches we use statistics in order to frame. So these are the assumptions that evidence-informed policymaking holds for data use, but also the sites that we analyze. And the different knowledge and governance governance effects root in something that is very important to understand for us here, because that has an impact on how we see the SDGs. So data use is really deeply motivational at times. GDP is the best example that we actually have. And this motivational use can cause a lot of backlash. We see that recently, this year, especially with all the DEI problems in the US, the data sets, but we previously had that with Greece, with Tanzania, with Fiji, where statistics really became contested and politicized. So while they are instruments of collective political action, they can also lead to contestation and politicization. Hence, the use really needs to be governed by ethical principles to understand that it is a collective tool that is not without problems. If we look at these problems and challenges, obviously, and this is the last slide on the general introduction where we situate data use in policymaking, we do have three different and big areas where we actually need to understand that it's not just statistical literacy that might be a challenge to data use in policymaking. Obviously, the first element is indeed there, the capacity capability question. Do people really understand statistics in the narrow sense of data literacy, so the numerical skills, but also in the broader understanding of data literacy, meaning this augmented view on instrumental use, on how politics of data use unfold while we are injecting evidence and statistics. The other point is, but that might be a problem for academics and scientists in part, to understand that there's a behavioral dimension. So it might be in a very good interest to policymakers to ignore a particular piece of evidence or data. So it's not just missing literacy, but also motivational components of evidence use, plus a certain distance between policymakers and the academic community. For instance, if we work around uncertainty, which you usually have with trajectories in timelines or developments, that is different for the academic community to embrace uncertainty as a movement of our work, while in politics it's quite a game changer, or rather closer. Another problem that also the SDGs face is the idea of quite technocratic governance by numbers, meaning very anti-democratic. So who decides what data is to be collected, and who decides what piece of evidence, numerical evidence, is taken into consideration. So there's a lot of, especially around this contestation and politicization, a lot of agreement that this is not just factual and numerical evidence that we are talking about. So the second leg is obviously the measuring sustainable development. What we actually saw over the years, and especially culminating in the SDGs, is that sustainable development, ever since the 70s, ever since the Stockholm Conference on Human Development, developed a strong traction as a global normative framing container and framing narrative. So in this framing, we brought together areas that were previously seen as quite distant. We also brought together, meaning social, environmental, economic, we also brought together this dichotomy of strong and weak sustainability. So strong sustainability in the sense that we have to accept that there are thresholds of natural resources that beyond which we can't exploit. So the limitation of human use, while weak sustainability ideas would argue rather that man-made capital, human-made capital, can substitute for resources also beyond these thresholds. So these two very divergent views of how we should engage with the planet. And especially the SDGs, after the MDGs, giving this poverty-centered, human-centered idea on development. So the global sustainable development discourse really changed the way states across the globe defined the development the sort of development that they wanted to achieve for their people. At the same time, with the SDGs, came this global governance by numbers, by indicators, processes. We defined the SDGs, defined 17 SDGs with targets that were specified by statistics, and these statistics were classical indicators for which we had longer timelines for many states, but basically they were the main reference frame. So with the SDGs, data became the main reference frame for materializing an idea of development. Hence, we have the direct connection between development, sustainability, governance, measuring, and data, where data went beyond this numerical proof of something, so beyond just counting something, became a political instrument of global governance. We do also have a lot of institution building around this global governance by indicators. So the interagency expert groups for the SDGs that basically define the GIF and run the GIF, so the global indicator framework. Beyond that, we have national indicator frameworks. We have local indicators developed in a way where you see the governance component alongside the ideational, the framing, the normative part, very much prescribed how global governance developed ever since the SDGs as these measurement processes that tie development support, public money given to countries back to assessment and to assessment by statistics. The development went in a way that we had different tiers, the ones that we have stably, the ones that we have but need methodological further development, and the unicorns that would be nice to have. And what was linked to the SDGs was indeed this global data revolution. And just look at these number of data records, which I think is very, very interesting and important to see that ever since 2016, when the work on the global indicator framework started, it actually multiplied in an extent way. So we really have a data revolution where national statistical offices, international organizations indeed try to capture as much of capacity building and finance as much as capacity building on the ground. So that's what led us to the idea, well, let's look, what does that mean? What do the use of indicators and data for the SDG indeed mean? We focus on, in the book has 90 authors. We do have 35 chapters. 5 different parts, the politics, the capacity, capabilities, the ethics are in one part. We do have another part that focuses on the context, and also one part that deals with skills, a final one that deals with each SDG. But our idea was we need to understand the relevance and impact. So how did that came about, and what was the journey ever since 16? How big is the normative element? What are the functions? How did all of that developed? Ethical questions are dealt with, and then these examples for use cases. Guiding questions very much focus around this big one here, so how to measure sustainable development, and focusing very much on role, impact, quality, production, and literacies. So basically everything that we in the data for policy community work around. And with that, I move on and give the floor to Mira, who tells you a bit about the back office work we did on a data set that is called the political economy of measuring sustainable development.
Thank you, Gaby. The introduction to this part of the presentation draws very heavily on Gaby's part of the presentation, because, as she mentioned earlier, our work on this data set was grounded in the many years of work that Gaby has done in this field leading up to this. And also we had seen that the data set on governance measures was actually very well used and taken up by actors in different contexts. So we had already this knowledge that there was a desire for someone to really go into how we are measuring concepts such as sustainable development, and who is measuring them and why, and give them this overview that they could dig into. As Gaby alluded to, there are a lot of critiques of the SDGs themselves. So of the concepts that did or did not go into them, the actors that were or were not involved in their development, and how these fit together now in terms of their implementation. So for that reason, we really wanted to take a step away when we looked at this data set from the SDGs alone and look at sustainable development, and look at that landscape of indices and reports that have come about to complement the data on the SDGs themselves. As already presented by Gaby in the first part, in terms of our rationale for why we wanted to look into this geopolitical and political economy part of the producers and funders, this was really down to these questions of who creates these indices, who finances them, and who is seeking to set or try to set a global narrative on what sustainable development means in practice and how countries are ranked, rated, and evaluated. This stands very distinct from an espousal of this approach. So our investigation of it, and the same with what we're doing across well-being, etc., doesn't come from an explicit espousal of this lens of setting a global narrative. It's an investigation of who is trying to do that and why. And if you have, on the one hand, these actors who are trying to set a global narrative, how accessible is this to the actors on the ground in the civil society? So the indices and the reports that they put out, to what extent can they be used by an NGO in a specific context who would like to make that relevant for the work that they're doing? So in our sample, we decided, as I mentioned earlier, to look at sustainable development, or SDGs. The index and report had to be multi-annual, multi-pillar, and multinational. So not focusing on one context alone, not focusing on one area or goal alone, and not focusing or not produced in 1 year alone, which together mean that the indices had the potential to, or the ambition to, set this global discourse and direction. By extension, that means that cases were excluded if they were papers that only presented a methodology, and there are many of those. Papers that were only a one-off, so sometimes a paper presented a methodology and then applied it to a single case as an example. If the index and report was multi-pillar, multi-annual, but it was for a single context, then it was not part of this. We excluded corporate sustainability for the moment because we really wanted to be looking at government-level discourse setting. And any indices that looked only at subjective data, because that took us too far away from this framework of the indicators of the SDGs. And that meant the exclusion of 74 cases, with a final sample of 11. The cases divided themselves quite naturally into 3 pillars. So we had the transnational organization pillar of indices. We had the indices that sit in the middle in terms of not being custodian agencies, unlike the FAO, UN, and OECD. So we had the EU indices. And the SDSN straddles this space because it's not a custodian agency, it's not a transnational or transgovernmental organization, but the presence of a lot of national governments in its funding and in its support and production, and its positioning, in its own words, under the auspices of the UN Secretary General, puts it at this interesting hybrid position, because it's also the recipient of a lot of private funding. And then the third pillar are these very small independent indices that come from university groups or small companies. In terms of the analysis, we went into these 6 frames, and each frame is a sheet of codes and analyses. We had the quality of the index, so what it constitutes, the definition of sustainable development, what indicators it's using, and how it's using that data. Then we went into the political economy of production and of funding. So that's numbers 2 and 4 here on this list. What types of entities are providing these indices? Then in the geopolitics of production and funding, we look at where in the world and what kind of income levels these producers and funders are coming from. And then finally, the data quality. So how accessible is this data? How reproducible? How modifiable? How understandable is it? And what levels of disaggregation is it operating at? I'm not running through these, but this is just to give you an idea of what the codebook looks like. And we spent many months building on the work that Gaby did in the global governance dataset, building these indicators. So we have our codebook that we run through, and then we have a similar one that we've created for well-being. So in terms of the nature of the indices, like I said, these are very select findings because we had 80 codes, and I'm not going to go into the results of all of those. In terms of the number of sub-indices, you see quite a strong influence of the SDGs in framing how these indices are structured. The 1 to 3 is a bit like these pillars of social, environmental, and economic. In terms of the number of areas, likewise, 1 to 20, so frequently 17. The number of indicators, however, has a lot of variation. So here, when we're getting to very high numbers of indicators, at the 101 to 120, we have the furthest extreme, and then up, even going beyond 200. But you also have some indices that have 1 to 20 indicators. So the spectrum of how complicated and how detailed this mapping and framing and measuring of sustainability is really broad. In terms of how they use different data types, they almost all used objective and subjective data. So that is quite to be expected, but subjective data was very, very prevalent. It took only one indicator to be relying on surveys in terms of people self-reporting for that to come in terms of subjective. And we really went into, for every index, the full list of indicators to find where they are, and jotted them down. So we see, okay, what are the things that we're measuring that are relying on this human reporting to give us the information? Quite as to be expected, official statistics are very predominant. there is quite a strong presence of predictive modeling or imputation, which is more or less evident. It's not always stated up front, the extent to which that's part of the index. It takes a lot of finding to find whether it's part of what they use. And alternative data is a very small fraction for the moment. In general, they look at a ranking, rating, and progress evaluation for the most part. So fortunately, we don't have as many indices who are just giving you a ranking without any explanation behind it or contextualization. Coverage-wise, again, here you see the role that the SDGs played in the sort of development and creation of these indices. By contrast, what we're finding in the well-being data set is very different. They really predate the SDGs and kind of flow all the way along. And these ones here that you see predating 2015 are the small independent ones that came about as small research groups that were looking to understand sustainable development before the SDGs came into being. In terms of the producers of the indices, mostly research organizations, as to be expected, a strong presence of intergovernmental organizations and international research groups. We decided quite recently to look at the sex of the lead authors. And even if in some of the indices, the very top lead was female, there was a dominant proportion of male leads on the indices. But here, when we go into the geopolitical level, we start to get the findings that are what we expected, but it was quite striking to see it in such stark terms. The continent and the income groups of the production of the indices are exclusively high income. The only exception for lower middle income is the index that was produced by UNSCAP, the Asia Pacific, which is a unique exception because it's a custodian agency, so it has a lot of clout and power. When we see Americas, it's all North America, and there isn't a single index that is produced exclusively outside of this dominant minority world context. We see very similar patterns in terms of the funders. In terms of the balance between private and public, interestingly, there was a lot of public funding in indices where we didn't necessarily expect it. So in the SDSN, for example, governments getting involved, alongside big corporations and big family foundations. And a very interesting thing would be to try and understand what are their interests behind that. In terms of the geopolitical levels, we see the same trends. So high income dominating how they're funding these. When you see combination here, all it took was for there to be one funder that comes from a non-high income context for it to be coded as combination. But the dominant context is high income. The same in Europe, the same in terms of location, sorry. In Europe, as far as single context origins of these funders go. And in terms of combination, Europe and North America were still highly prevalent. And finally, in terms of the data quality, we wanted to really understand if tomorrow a civil society organization wanted to pick up on these reports, to what extent could they start making them relevant for what they're looking at? There was very little disaggregation in these reports. So they stayed mostly at a national level and at most actually aggregated to regionals. They did, as we mentioned earlier, go a bit more into the analysis and discussion. So that was a positive element in terms of just giving a dashboard without explanation behind it. But we see a really low presence of non-traditional data. And that's something that we're finding also in some of our research into the localization of the SDGs. What are the barriers to there actually being non-traditional data coming in to fill these gaps? There's a strong basis in other systems, so grounding in the SDGs, as we saw in terms of their origins, and that helps them be relatively externally coherent. But their internal coherence is often lacking. To some extent, maybe the liberty that they have in order to build these indices means that from one year to the next, the methodology changes. And in many cases, they flag, please don't compare this over time because it's not comparable. And that makes it hard for a civil society entity to really use this and track it and bring it into their everyday work. I won't run into these because these are what we've already discussed now. There were only two interesting elements that really came out that didn't slot into the findings we were looking for. In terms of the funders, the Happy Planet Index for a very long time didn't state its funders. And only recently did it start stating who funds it. And it's actually funded by a small family foundation, which is the family of the person who leads the company who created the index. The SCAP, on the other hand, used to have a very detailed list of all of its funders, private, public, foundations, governments, etc. And that, as of this year, was not available anymore. In many cases, there was no definition of sustainable development provided, and the SDSN was one of those conspicuous ones as well that never defined sustainable development. They introduced it in one report in 2024, and in 2025, it's gone. We alluded to the range of funders in the SDSN context. It's this really interesting hybrid entity sitting at this crossroads of the different pillars of who's involved in the sustainable development governance. But in the Sustainable Development Index, which is a small, very, very, very small organization built with researchers from universities, it's an absolute black box of who produces it. And even after contacting them and replying, they don't give us necessarily information on who's behind it, where do their donations come from. It's one of these unusual sort of cloudy indices where we're not sure what the interests are. Now I'll hand over to Igor, who's going to give us this absolute overview of all of the lessons that we've been drawing on in all of our discussions so far.
Thank you, Mira. So I'll talk about kind of the conclusions and the insight we got from the book, from the companion. To start with, so we focused on like 4 pillars of inquiry, starting with the evolution of SDG data and indicators. And here we recognize from normative, ethical, and political economy lenses the actual normative and political character of SDG and agenda and SDG indicators, and we try to combine both like strictly academic research perspectives, but also practical perspectives from practitioners. The second one is on data quality. We acknowledge that data quality in the context of SDG can support more nuanced prioritization and synergies among indicators, because priorities, we acknowledge and recognize that priorities within the SDG agenda are somewhat problematic. The third strand is evolves around data literacy, and here the main motto was to assume and to provide some evidence that increased data literacy can increase and help achieve SDGs and make them more actionable. And the last pillar is achieving SDG lessons learned. So this concerns the last part of the book, where we have individual chapters for individual SDGs, and the insight is on how each individual SDG, what are the issues there, what are the issues with data, what are the issues with communication and implementation about those. Next slide, please. Yeah. So, what do we find out from all these chapters? We firstly, what kept repeating in the individual chapters is the importance of contextualization, or better said, the lack thereof in current SDG agenda and current SDG implementation. Essentially, contextualization, again, as I already mentioned, the starting position is that indicators are not objective completely. They have some normative and political and subjective character to them. And we see contextualization, or the insight, the results from the analysis, they point to the contextualization as not only transferring in terms of selection of indicators, all the functions of SDG implementation to a local level, from global to local level, but it also represents a continuous process of reinterpreting what global community needs, what local community needs, and focusing on actually on the meaning, not only what works, but also how do we define certain concepts, including inequality, climate change, and so so forth. So the point of contextualization is how we that there is a need to translate global ideas, global standards, benchmarks for local needs, to adapt them, to adjust them, so they are actionable at the local level. Next slide, please. Next, what we find in the book is that that concerns meaningful measures and data quality. This again points to the actionability problem of SDGs, meaning that there is a gap between what national level, regional, and local levels need and want for SDG implementation, and what is being offered at the global level of the SDG agenda. So the point here is that the book points to the need for balancing what works with what matters, because through the lens of data quality, to plug these gaps in and to achieve greater, again, actionability. As you can see, I'm repeating this word actionability because this is this has repeatedly come up as a significant challenge in majority of SDGs. Next slide, please. The next one that is the next insight that comes from the companion concerns the non-traditional data. Here we recognize the added value of data that is not traditionally included in SDG agenda and measuring of SDG indicators. And these non-traditional types of data include big data and Earth observation data. And the book points to their potential, their capacity to increase accuracy in measuring, but also to decrease the burden of monitoring of data trends. But here, from a broader perspective, the point is that there should be some flexibility of established statistical, both national and global statistical standards and systems, to include some new elements, innovative elements, such as big data and Earth observation data. And this would then enhance established methods that by default exclude some groups in society in terms of quantification, in terms of data collection, such as indigenous populations, nomadic people, and others. So with these new innovative data types, we could to some extent address also that. And please, next slide. And lastly, we identify 3 challenges that are still to be addressed, but they also reflect what we find in the book. With the book, the first challenge concerns the discourse around sustainable development, and so this goes back to the contextualization argument that rather than challenging existing conceptions, that the discourse should challenge existing conceptions of concepts like inequality, climate change, so forth, progress, and not only be focused on the targets, baselines, and how to what extent each country moves toward a target or away from the target. So there is more conceptual meaning in the discourse. In the discourse should be added to it. The second one is about priorities, and here we argue that some tensions, primarily tension between what is traditionally in the statistical systems and standards and what should be added as non-traditional elements in this system, should be addressed. And one of the biggest tensions, I already mentioned this, is the universal character or current universality of the indicators of the SDGs, but that is often in a mismatch with local needs and local preferences. The third challenge concerns statistical capacity, and here we argue that there should be multilateral investments in statistical capacity to improve data quality and to plug some data gaps. There are some efforts already ongoing, but I think this should be. We find and argue that this should be amplified. And lastly, in terms of systems change, we highlight coordination across systems among data users, data producers, and decision makers as one of the pertinent challenges in further pursuit of the sustainability mission and implementation of individual SDGs. And within that, obviously, as many of the chapters in the book recognize, the definition of progress, so what it is, how to measure weaknesses of all these systems. These are still open questions that are difficult to answer at this point, and there will be, we suspect, much more research is needed to kind of to address those questions. Yep. Thank you for your attention. We look forward to the questions.
Thank you, Gaby, Mira, and Igor. I think in the interest of time, should we ask the floor if there is any questions from the audience firstly, or if not, then I'm happy to also prop a bit.
Thank you very much. This is very exciting findings. I'd like to ask you a question about the tension between traditional statistics and also new innovative approach. How these dynamics occur, in the sense that I'd imagine that the expert might be opposed to some new ideas because they say that it's not reliable, or it's not very based upon science. So how these new approaches really came to be adopted? Who are the key actors in bringing in, and then how these dynamics occur?
Thank you so much. And perhaps to say that I work for UNICEF, and that's a custodian agency of SDG indicators. I work adjacent to them, not in the team that's computing the indicators. One thing that really resonates with me is that often I hear that countries indeed don't find the SDGs particularly helpful for making policies within their sort of countries. Often data needs to be much more granular at sort of subnational level in order to be important. A lot of SDG data is not collected at that level. So just wanted to emphasize that point. And my question is really around, look, I mean, it's interesting to see the low use of alternative data, right? The high reliance on surveys, DHS has gone away. Essentially, nothing is going to be able to step into that place. What I think we have to think about is also like the role that surveys are going to play going forward and what's going to step into its place. Alternative data, I would love to add that there's also data from information management systems that is often really underexplored when it comes to the use for SDG indicators, and it has the potential to deliver data at a level that actually could be relevant for decision making also at subnational level. But the challenge that I see sometimes, I would love to sort of like hear from you, your view on that, is like, you know, to what extent is there a risk that some of the architecture that we're building for measurement of SDGs, no matter like who does it, ultimately stands in competition with also strengthening national capacity in order to collect the data that is actually useful for the government that wants to provide for its citizens?
Hi, thank you to all our presenters. I really appreciated the presentation a lot. I'm into global political economy, and so I had a question related to kind of the political economic analysis that was presented. I guess I was wondering, you guys highlight some of the connections between like the funding, and I was interested in understanding, as the funding environment continues to change, particularly in the context of development, UN, I look at the World Bank a lot in my work. Would you expect to see maybe changes in terms of what types of indicators get looked at or not? Or is there any indication that you have around that in your work? Thank you.
Actually, thank you very much for these questions that very, very intensely speak to what we looked into, and a bit, Yarime, yours, and Friederike, your comments go a bit into the same direction of alternative data and how this came about, and if there's a certain competition in between the NSOs, so National Statistical Office production of classical data that is used, and these new forms of data. Earth observation we had in the book. We have big data. So what we found is that indeed the main focus, and that could potentially speak to a more traditional and conventional approach to the data, the quality of data that is used for the SDG, is on statistical capacity, institutional statistical capacity building, trying to indeed plug the gaps in the timelines, the data points, so that the NSOs produce the official statistics that are relevant for the SDG. Why is that the case? Because official statistics still have come with a particular trust marker, which helps the process. So it's the rigor, the methodology, the quality of the data, and the possibility for data harmonization at global level to increase comparability that still prioritizes NSOs and official statistics as the main source. If we look into areas like biodiversity, in Earth observations, urban areas, density, population density, these very much come in, also connected to international organizations like NASA, to bring in additional layers of observations that could fill gaps in areas that are more remote, in areas where statistical official statistics are problematic. The question is whether these alternative forms that are also championed, like in Eurostat, they developed in the meantime a unit for experimental statistics, who very much work on how we can make scale these experimental statistics up in a way and make broader use for national reporting also, but also for reporting for the SDGs. So my feeling would be that it would not distract funding from the existing data infrastructure, but rather be used to fill the gaps, and by that more amalgamating with the existing rather than substituting existing data collection. Many of the endeavors are private and academic. So we have an example of British University who worked with observations in a monitoring platform, so that not necessarily public budgets, executive published budgets are providing for that, but the research budgets. And one point important, I do think that this is a growth area for knowledge co-production, quantitative knowledge co-production for the SDGs that relies on a huge level of expertise. So I assume that all the citizen science that we had at the very beginning when we discussed on alternative forms of data linked to biodiversity, coral reef, bird spotting, that this will not be something that we could leverage at scale to fill the gaps, but rather these university academic activities that are provide sandboxes for testing an application that is broader than just the test application. So answering the question, Friederike, I rather think that it's a combined and integrated infrastructure in data governance rather than competing approaches to feeding the SDGs in. With the political economy, and that's what my contribution to the answer was, political economy of funding. We saw quite, at least for the for sustainable development and for the previous work on governance, quite similar patterns. So highly high income countries, funders that are groupable in the northern hemisphere. So the danger of creating avatars of this group of developed economies rather than meaningful measures of governance and sustainable development. What we do have in the private sector, so we have the SDGs and the measurement data used for the SDGs, which is strongly NSO focused, official statistics focused. we do have in the private marketplace, so the academic providers and the private providers, a bit of a marketplace of conceptualizations of sustainable development. What I expect to happen there is a bit of a dying out of the timeline comparability in between the private and academic ones, so that they rather shrink the menu and provide continue providing annual assessments, but with a bit of a less methodological rigor. And there again, I assume, because of the trust marker, a move towards institutional endeavors, so official statistics engaged in these broader sustainable development measures. And with that, over to the other two, to Igor and Mira.
Thank you. I would just quickly want to reinstate the importance of what Gaby was saying, and to highlight, I think in this coordination challenge that we identify, to highlight the arguably a crucial role of national statistics offices and their existing infrastructure, as because they have trust, they have practices that this level may be a suitable level for dealing with the tension between traditional and non-traditional ways of measuring and including non-traditional types of data through some mechanism of co-production that could still be useful at the global level. But obviously the issue is of funding and infrastructure to do that, because there is already now disparity among countries in collecting data, reporting and data coverage, which is a prominent challenge in the SDGs. So if this takes place, if this takes off somehow, an issue of keeping covering the globe to the much possible extent, or investing in trainings and infrastructures all over the world, not only the West, because the West is currently performing relatively better than the other global regions, would be crucial. So in sum, this would be sort of coordination exercise where national offices all over the globe would take the leading role and figure out how to co-produce this for the purpose of actionability and policy implementation of SDGs on a global level, having in mind that, again, what our book says, the contextualization should be somewhat addressed. So this universality of SDGs could be scaled down or redefined. We have already this for example, in SDG 1, no poverty, and SDG 2, zero hunger. We have some indicators that account for national, regional differences. So this would be dynamic.
I'll be super brief, and here drawing on actually an excellent chapter in the book precisely on localization that really, I think, touched on all three questions. In terms of the first question of who's behind the usage of non-traditional statistics and what's that process of starting to use them, a bit as we alluded to at the beginning of the presentation, the fact that the SDGs are not binding in terms of forcing, quote unquote, anybody to use a specific indicator or a specific methodology. We have this very interesting example from that chapter of governments from Kenya, Uganda, and Rwanda, and studying sort of how these SDG indicators are manifesting at their national levels. And they cited examples of how they just decided to start using a non-traditional source of data, because the SDGs, for however universal the global indicator framework is, give you that liberty at a national level to decide to do that and to bring in non-traditional data in your national reporting in place of the data that was mandated at the top. It does create a bit of tension according to the findings from the author Gloria Novovic, where she went and interviewed people at all levels of that governance system, there is that tension. And she termed, I think actually one of her interviewees termed it imaginary statistics. So the sort of global level that can kind of comfortably assume that it's easy for everybody to just produce data of the same type and from the same source, versus the people on the ground saying, well, we have a totally different source of that information, and that's what we're going to use. And no one can really do anything about that, in a sense, even if anyone opposes it. They actually want to bring in a lot more civil society organization data. So from Earth observation, from citizen science. One of the key oppositions that they find, and maybe that connects to Nai Lee's question, is the frameworks set out by donor organizations and overseas development assistance. So she cited from her interviews and from her focus groups and workshops that at the SDG level, there's been a general understanding that reporting on sustainable development has shifted towards national priorities, and that a country has every right to choose data and indicators that really represent, that draw on the SDGs, but really represent where they are at that point in time. That's not the case for the donor and ODA sector, where their frameworks in terms of data quality and their frameworks in terms of the indicators on which you must report have stayed quite stagnant and haven't moved along with this nation-centered idea of what it means to report on progress and sustainable development. Critically, they tend to have very, very, very low tolerance for error in the work of that reporting, and also low tolerance for budgetary allocation to that monitoring and evaluation work. So that tension between wanting it to be highly streamlined and yet needing to allocate that budget. And I think that then connects to the final one, because the interviews that Gloria did also went to work with UN agencies. And they did this is to Friederike's question, the officials there really did cite this challenge, though, in terms of the budget allocated to them having stayed the same, but their role having doubled, i.e. they're maintaining or needing to maintain this transnational technical expertise, but also support nations in developing their own national statistical expertise in their own contexts. And if the budget allocated to them has stayed relatively unchanged, they were finding not a conceptual clash, but a practical tension in terms of how they dedicate their time and resources to those two parallel streams. And then that comes in tension with, I guess, again, to the question of the US's withdrawal from multilateralism and a shift away maybe from the ODA model and people wanting to work more specifically with governments. When you want to work more specifically with governments, but you don't have the tolerance for the data that the government has available and for the time and cost that it takes to do that, that might be one of the challenges that the system might be facing in the coming years.
And a last footnote on that from us, we will dive into this localization aspect at the World Statistics Congress. So whoever joins the World Statistics Congress in The Hague in 2 weeks, 3 weeks, we will have a panel on that.
Thanks again, all our speaking guests here today.
Thank you very much for the opportunity and for joining. Thanks a lot.
Always.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.